Hi everyone, hope this finds you well and learning to appreciate things that you never appreciated before, like sitting in your garden. You know, it's such a rare event for me to be sitting still long enough to appreciate our garden that I thought good to make a recording of it. But the ironic thing is, this is not a video of me appreciating our garden. It's a video of me using our garden as an illustration to share the gospel. And you know, earlier this week, the thought struck me that up until these recent weeks of being confined at home, for years our garden to me had become merely something I walked through on the way to somewhere more important. And I began to wonder if in fact that was not true also of the way many of us have been treating these days that we're living through. We're living through them, but we're not living in them. As the week has gone on, I began to think how sad it would be if it turns out that for many of us we're spending a whole life like that. We're living through all our days, but we're never really living in those days, in the fullness of what life can be. Because we keep living as if the full life, the wonderful life we want to live is always in the future, it's always somewhere else. We live thinking that when I get this season over with, when all this lockdown finishes, or when I get these tasks finished, or when I finally get that degree, finally buy that house, finally build that church, finally rear my family, whatever it is we're trying to achieve, when I finally get that done, then I can start to live the wonderful life I've always wanted to live. And you know, there's something really wrong about that way of thinking. You know, I think we all recognize that what a tragedy it would be to spend a lifetime toiling and striving to achieve a wonderful life, and then on your deathbed suddenly realize that the most wonderful things in life were under your nose all along and you missed them. You had lived through your life, but not in your life. And that's why when something interrupts our headlong dash into the future, that interruption has the potential to be a turning point in our lives. You know, there are days that come along in life when an event happens that forces us to put everything aside that we had planned, and we find ourselves and we find our lives interrupted long enough for us to see something about our lives that we had not seen before. Now, we could call these days out of time, days that seem to lift us out of our script, our plan for our lives, and set us down for a few brief hours usually in a place we never expected to be, a place from where we suddenly see our lives from a different perspective. Now, over the years, I've had that experience, especially in Ireland, usually at wakes and funerals, because normally there's just a 1 or 2 days notice, and the plans you had for your week are swept aside, and you find yourself sitting in the midst of a group of friends and family, all contemplating for a few hours the fragile and precious nature of life itself, and all of us resolving that we're going to slow down and pay more attention to the loved ones all around us. But no matter the benefit that comes from such an experience, you know, I don't believe, and I don't believe you would either, for one moment, that the good Lord arranged those deaths, those funerals, in order to get our attention. And it seems to me that the good Lord did not arrange coronavirus to get anyone's attention. He doesn't need to release a teacher into the world called coronavirus, because he already has a teacher in the world called the Holy Spirit. The Spirit who teaches us that far from being caught unaware by evil, our Heavenly Father is actually able to cause all things, that's a beautiful word, all things, that includes a pandemic, to work together for good to those who love Him, to those who are called according to His purpose. And that's Romans 8:28. Now, in the book of Acts, in chapter 8, it records a death, and that death is almost like the starting point for a whole series of events. It records the death of Stephen, and at that death a great persecution broke out against the early church, and great suffering resulted as the church was scattered and families were separated. God was not the instigator of either Stephen's death or that persecution. In fact, within days the Lord made it very clear to Saul of Tarsus when he met him on the road to Damascus that he counted himself, the Lord, as the persecuted, not the persecutor. Yet in the midst of all that, that same chapter records that those who were scattered went from place to place preaching the gospel, and so the church grew and was strengthened. The Good Shepherd, who wants to gather us to Himself, in the words of Jesus, like a mother hen gathers her chicks. He's not the one who brings death to scatter and separate families. But just like in Acts 8, I have no doubt that in the midst of this scattering and separating, God's Spirit is right now bringing about a great turning for the good. The sort of turning that happens when our lives get interrupted. Only right now, it isn't just a few friends and family who have had their lives interrupted for a few hours. Whole nations have had their headlong dash into their planned future for themselves interrupted. You know, it feels a bit like the whole world is at a wake, mourning the passing of the future they had planned for themselves. Millions of people are finding themselves lifted out of time and set down in a place where they have the opportunity to see from a different perspective. Now, I began by saying that our garden had become something I walked through on the way to somewhere more important. And the impression that's really growing in me is that we should be aware of dismissing these days of confinement as just something we have to get through in order to get somewhere else, somewhere more important. Especially if somewhere else is simply to return to the life blinded by our own speed. It's that sort of thinking, you know, that we just need to get on to somewhere else, that life hasn't really begun yet, but will one day if we keep running towards it. That sort of thinking has always blinded us to the miracle and the gift that the day we're in actually is. The wonderful life that we're searching for is not the absence of trouble. It is the presence of God, the presence of a Father in the lives of those who have ran through life as if orphaned. The wonderful life He has for us is not somewhere in a future filled with activity. It is in having our eyes opened in the day we're in to the wonder, the miracle all around us, the gift of life itself. Now that gift, all of creation, even the birds we hear singing here, the beauty of the flowers, the laughter of our children, all that points to a giver of the gift. And the beautiful gospel tells us who this giver is and the enormity of what He has given. He is a giver who has loved us so much, too much, to leave us to make a life by ourselves, for ourselves. He is a giver who could not bear us to be alone, and so sent His Son and His Spirit to prepare a life for us, the most wonderful life there is, a life with Him. I guess the medical experts will decide for us how long people have to be confined, how long their lives have to be interrupted in order that we may go back to the lives that we were living through. But I want to leave you with a different thought today. How long do you think you need to be confined in order for you to stop living through these days and start living in these days? How long does it take for life to slow down enough that you get to see what you could not see before? That the most wonderful life is not the one you're chasing called the absence of trouble, but the one that finds you called the presence of God, life with Him. This life with Him can be lived right in the midst of trouble, because it's not a life that requires you or I to avoid trouble. Because life with Him is the life that overcomes all the trouble of this world by seeing it differently, by seeing it like David saw Goliath. He saw him as simply no match for the life that was with him. You know, no matter how long it takes, this turning away from the life we had planned and entering into the one He has prepared is the greatest turning point in our life. And ever after that, when that happens, that turning point, each time we stop long enough and get quiet enough to hear His gentle direction, He brings us again to the most significant turning points of our lives. And I believe that even today, multitudes of people have been stopped long enough to hear His call, the call of the shepherd who gathers, who makes us to lie down in places of provision, who lays a feast for us right in the very presence of our enemies, sickness and death. You know, such a life He has prepared for us. This life with Him is beautifully described in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for You are with me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Imagine such a life where you no longer had to run through this life chasing goodness and loving kindness, because goodness and loving kindness just went wherever you went, because He was with you. He who is goodness and loving kindness. You know, I pray that everyone listening to this message, by the time this interruption is over, you too will be one of these people who was stopped long enough to turn away from living through the life you have planned and start living in the life He has prepared, life with Him. In such a life, we never have to treat any day as something we are just going through in order to get somewhere better. For there is nowhere better than living in the day He has prepared for you, the day of His presence, the day with Him. For one day in His presence is better than 1,000 elsewhere. God bless you.